Good evening, church family. It is good to see each of you tonight. Let's go ahead and stand together, have a word of prayer before we begin to sing. Heavenly Father, we come before you tonight, and we thank you for the way that you are always at work for the blessings in our lives. Thank you for the time of fellowship that we've already had, the time that we'll spend together tonight in prayer and in song and in your word. We ask that you be honored and glorified. In your name, amen. Let us sing together this evening. Our rock, in him we hide, a shelter in the time of storm. Secure whatever ill betide, a shelter in the time of storm. Oh, Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a weary land, a weary land. Oh, Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a shelter in the time of storm. A shade by day, defense by night, a shelter in the time of storm. No fears, alarm, no foes affright, a shelter in the time of storm. Oh, Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a weary land, a weary land. Oh, Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a shelter in the time of storm. The raging storms may round us beat, a shelter in the time of storm. We'll never leave our safe retreat, a shelter in the time of storm. Oh, Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a weary land, a weary land. Oh, Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a shelter in the time of storm. Oh, rock divine, oh, refuge dear, a shelter in the time of storm. Be thou our helper ever near, a shelter in the time of storm. Oh, Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a weary land, a weary land. Oh, Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a shelter in the time of storm. Have faith in God when your pathway is lonely. He sees and knows all the way you have trod. Never alone are the least of his children. Have faith in God, have faith in God. Have faith in God, he's on his throne. Have faith in God, he watches o'er his own. He cannot fail, he must prevail. Have faith in God, have faith in God. Have faith in God when your prayers are unanswered. Your earnest plea he will never forget. Wait on the Lord, trust his word and be patient. Have faith in God, he'll answer yet. Have faith in God, he's on his throne. Have faith in God, he watches o'er his own. He cannot fail, he must prevail. Have faith in God, have faith in God. Have faith in God in your pain and your sorrow. His heart is touched with your grief and despair. Cast all your cares and your burdens upon him, and leave them there, oh, leave them there. Have faith in God, he is on his throne. Have faith in God, He watches o'er His own. He cannot fail, He must prevail. Have faith in God, have faith in God. Have faith in God, though all else fail about you. Have faith in God, He provides for His own. He cannot fail, though kingdom shall perish. He rules, He reigns upon His throne. Have faith in God, He is on His throne. Have faith in God, He watches o'er His own. He cannot fail, He must prevail. Have faith in God, have faith in God. Please be seated.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's good to see you on this nice, cool fall November evening. Hadn't it been a pretty day? Started off a little chilly, but it was nice this afternoon. Except, it's dark at 5:30. That does hurt my feelings. But you know what? It's been that way my whole life. You'd think I'd be used to it by now, but I'm not. I'm still bitter about it. We need to make daylight savings time permanent. I know it was invented later. I get it, but it's better, right? No? You like it being dark at 5:15? Okay. Yeah. All right. For those of us that are more normal, just kidding. All right, we're going to continue church history this evening. However, we're going to be skipping ahead about 1,000 years. Now, we are going to go back and fill in all the blanks, but giving the season and the timing in which we are in, I wanted to just take a break from going chronologically and skip forward to some events that happened instead of the 4th century in the 15th century. So what's next week? I gave it away. See, I pushed the button too soon. Thanksgiving is next week. And, of course, you know, if you remember as a kid, you remember reading about the Pilgrims and the Indians coming together and having a big old meal and sharing things and all that stuff. But there's a lot more to it than just that. There's a lot of providence at play here. Matter of fact, Thanksgiving is an example of God's gracious providence. And we're going to look at that this evening. Again, you know, it's next week, but not much is spoken in our history books as far as details go. And these things are not only important for American history, they're also important for church history. And now the time we're going to be discussing, obviously here, is America is not yet a nation. That is still a century away. This is in the 1600s, and of course we know that America's birthday is what? July 4th, what year? 1776. You'd be surprised how many people do not know that. I mean, you don't have to be a history buff to know that. That's kind of important. So we're still over 100 years away from America officially becoming its own nation. But we're going to skip ahead from the 400s or 300s to the 15th century. Now, because we are skipping about 1,300 years or so in church history, we need to at least fill in some of the blanks to catch us up where we are. And we'll be covering more of that as we go back, but I at least want to give you a few highlights. Because in our study in the 4th century, we haven't even really gotten into Roman Catholicism yet. And that is going to be a huge part of church history. But for the context, for the time we are discussing in the 15th century, now we need to understand that the Reformation has already happened, right? This happened the century before. events we're going to be discussing tonight. Again, just to catch you up, the Roman Catholic Church had become increasingly corrupt and tyrannical. The gospel was not a focus at all. As a matter of fact, it was lost by most people. Most people went to church their whole lives and never even heard the gospel. People were being told that they have to purchase things to get their salvation or earn their salvation through works or making pilgrimages or praying before relics and all kinds of stuff. And of course, they weren't allowed to have the scriptures for themselves, so they did not know any better. They could not refute what the church was telling them because they assumed the church was telling them what the Bible said. But there was a group of studied, godly people that saw these things that the Roman Catholic Church was doing, and they had a desire to reform the church. These men are known as the Reformers. Of course, the RC Church didn't want Reformation. They wanted to keep things going the way it has been going because it was good for them. If they could convince people that they have to purchase indulgences to earn their own salvation or to spring a loved one from their made-up place of purgatory, then that was a lot of money coming in. And so when these reformers went to them, they said, hey, we need to get away from all this and start teaching the biblical truth that people are justified by faith alone. They wanted no part of that. And so instead of the church being reformed, the Protestant Reformation came about. The separatist movement came about, the first separatist movement. Through a series of important events that we are going to discuss later, this Protestant Reformation happened. And these people that broke away from Roman Catholicism were allowed eventually to have their own confession of faith, which is a huge deal. Because until then, the only statement of faith that was allowed was that which the church approved of. And so they were allowed to have their own confession of faith that was in accordance with their conscience and how they read the scriptures. Of course, even after this, there was a lot of elements of Roman Catholicism in the things they were doing because, again, that's all they had ever known. But the gospel was once again being preached. One of the groups that would come later out of the movement was the Church of England. And this is especially important for our discussion this evening. Once again, a lot of things had to take place for this organization to come into being, and we will discuss them later. But just like what happened with Roman Catholicism, the Church of England unfortunately also became corrupt and tyrannical. They too were telling people how they are to worship and what they are to believe, and much of what they were telling people was contrary to the Scriptures. So once again, there was a group of faithful, Bible-believing people that wanted to know the truth and preach the truth, and they wanted things to change. However, just again, like in Roman Catholicism, those in charge liked things the way they were, and they refused to listen to the truth. And even more, they persecuted those who were trying to speak the truth. And this led to people wanting to break free from the Church of England and start, again, another group. This is the English separatists. They saw the Reformation that took place before, and now they desired an English Reformation, which would happen. They knew, however, that this was not going to be allowed to happen in England. That they were going to, there's no way the church, if you think the Roman Catholic Church was brutal and mean, and they certainly were, the Church of England had some monsters, monstrous people making decisions. And many, many people died trying to break free from them. So these separatists, these reformers knew that they were not going to be able to live in England and have their own thing. And so they began thinking about where a place they could flee where they could worship God according to their own conscience and according to biblical standards. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, and this is very important, something else that was booming through the entire Atlantic, unfortunately, was the slave trade. The Spaniards were especially involved in this, and they mostly led the way through this region. And many of the slaves, the people in England were used to seeing and sometimes being around, were Native Americans. So, when they began thinking about a place they could flee to escape the corruption and the tyrannical overreach of the Church of England, America was on their mind. The New World, for them, was the place to go. They wanted to flee persecution, establish religious freedom, which meant the church, not the state, elected church leaders, and the Scriptures would be their ultimate authority about faith and practice. Now, I want to point out, as I usually do, that the religious freedom that they were seeking is vastly different than what most people mean today when they use the phrase religious freedom. When people today use the phrase religious freedom, most of the time that means that they want the state to have nothing to do with religion, or even more, that they want a freedom from religion altogether. It was vastly different what they meant. These people wanted a Christian society and culture. However, they wanted Christian society and culture to be built on biblical truths and principles. You understand what I'm saying? When they were looking for religious freedom, it did not mean they wanted a society completely freed from religion. They wanted to live in a society where its ruling class wasn't trying to impose on them a false gospel and false practices. Therefore, religious freedom did not mean, again, completely free from religion. It meant freedom from corrupt tyrants who sought to deceive people to justify their own greed. And the next 170 years would be filled with hope, with the hope of freedom, persecution, battles, suffering, but most importantly, God's providence. So that's what we're going to get into now. As I mentioned earlier, while these people were seeking to escape the Church of England, the slave trade was booming. Two very strong forces other than England during the time were the Spaniards and the French. Yep, if you can believe it, the French were strong. Okay, sorry. I don't want to offend. Anyway, there were a number of Spanish ship captains that made a lot of money by stealing and selling people. Many of the people they kidnapped, as I mentioned a while ago, were Native Americans. The main thing, again, to remember right now, all this is happening at the same time. So many are seeking to escape the corruption and tyranny of the Church of England, and the Atlantic slave trade is going on. In 1605, a Native American teenager was taken by slave traders to England. While in England, he learned English. And somehow, we really do not know how, but 9 years later in 1614, he was able to return home to his people. However, just a few days later, he was kidnapped and taken again. Does anybody know who I'm talking about? Melissa said it. Squanto. Most of you has anybody never heard of Squanto before? He's a very important person. Again, not only in history in general, but in church history, because God's providence is all over this story. That's him. Well, that's a depiction of him. They didn't have cameras back then, so that's a depiction. So at just a few days after returning home, after 9 years as a slave, he's thrown back on a ship, and he's once again in the world of slavery. Another ship captain came and led Squanto and others to believe they were accompanying him back to his ship to trade. But when they got on the ship, the captain's crew seized them and chained them up and sailed off with them. Once again, Squanto would be a slave. This time he was taken to Spain, where he was purchased by a Christian who was a loving and generous man and was committed to sharing the gospel and making disciples. Now, that will sound very counterintuitive to our modern American ears. That a guy that purchased a slave was a very kind and loving and Christian individual. Yes, folks. We have to be very careful about judging people in the past that lived in a very different time than we live. Now, does that mean that all their actions are excusable? Absolutely not. But we also need to understand that there's a different time in which they lived. And sometimes, one of the best things that could happen to somebody is to be, I'll say all the time, is to be around faithful, Bible-believing Christians. And so, did Squanto want to be taken as a slave? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. That would be silly to assume that. But knowing what he says at the end of his life, I can tell you this, he probably, if he could go back and do something different and it not happen, he probably wouldn't have done it. Because God used that as the means to save him. So, again, we'll get more of that in a second. He was taken to Spain, where he was purchased by a Christian, and this man was committed to making disciples. Then, he would end up traveling from Spain to England in 1618. He was treated like family. He was loved, but of course he still had a desire to be back with his own people. Eventually, it was agreed upon that he would be discipled there by the man that bought him, and then he would go back to his own people as a missionary to take the gospel to them. Because what we have to understand is America is still mostly Native American, and most of them have never heard the gospel before. So Squanto was all about that. In 1619, he returned home with optimism, looking forward to seeing his people and sharing the gospel with them and the love of Jesus. But sadly, when he arrived, he found out that his people were gone. The plague had made its way through there, and his tribe no longer existed. They didn't even have time for burial. I mean, everybody passed away so fast that there was literally a field of their bones and their remains laying there. Squanto felt lost. He felt alone. He was unsure what he was even going to do at this point. He even questioned God. He questioned if God cared about his people like he cared for the English. His greatest desire was to return to his tribe and his family and share the gospel with them. But now they were gone. He would end up joining the Wampanoag tribe. The chief of this tribe was very kind to him, but even so, he still felt like he didn't have a home. He was still wondering what his purpose was. And then meanwhile, the Puritans, some people call them pilgrims, I call them Puritans, were fleeing the tyranny of the Church of England, and they had arrived and settled in the land where Squanto's people once lived. Are you starting to see how this is coming together? They came with the same kind of optimism Squanto had when he was returning home. But heartache and strife would also come upon them. The winter was hard. They struggled finding food and other things that were necessary for survival. In fact, later on, over half of them would die after that first brutal winter. And if something didn't change quickly, the other half would be following very soon. Obviously, they were in a new land where the natives didn't speak their language, so even appealing to them for help would be very difficult. Plus, they weren't exactly trusted by the natives either, because most people that came from that part of the world wanted to steal them and kidnap them and sell them to people back in their part of the world. So they were a little weary there. And so here are these Puritans, these Christians, fleeing the Church of England in a new land on the verge of dying out from starvation, wondering if they will get any help whatsoever. And however, one day a native traveled to where they were staying. And to their surprise, and in God's divine providence, this Native American spoke English. Not only did he speak English, but he was a brother in Christ. Now, could you imagine? That's the last thing they expected to encounter. Who was this Native American Christian that spoke English? Squanto. There's another depiction of him showing up. They're on the verge of starving to death. They once very optimistic, filled with hope, new land, new opportunities, worship God the way He deserves to be worshiped. Now half of us have starved to death, and the other half is probably right behind them because we can't figure out how to survive here. God, in His providence, brings Squanto along. He and others would teach them how to fish, how to hunt, how to build shelters, how to plant crops. Had Squanto not came and helped, they would have certainly died. And if these people would have passed away during this time, all these Puritans, all these people that traveled over here from England, where would we as a nation be today? Would we even exist? We don't really know that for sure, but there's a good chance we wouldn't be here. God brought all this about. And with this, Squanto, who was lost, disheartened, not sure what direction to go, found his calling. Though his people were now gone, God has given him a new people. He also understood the providence of God that was evident throughout his life, even in the bad things. And he believed what men meant for evil, God meant for good, just like with the story of Joseph. Not only did these Puritans survive, but it would not be long until they were flourishing. A few years later, the food supply would be so great that the governor, William Bradford, invited the entire Wampanoag tribe to come and share a meal with them, and it was to be a great feast. Bradford titled that day a day of thanksgiving. It began in prayer. It lasted 3 days. And so that was the first Thanksgiving, and it was centered on God's providence and provision and coming together in a spirit of gratitude and thankfulness. And so, as Paul Harvey would say, and now you know the rest of the story. Thanksgiving is an example of God's gracious providence. Again, there's bad men did bad things. You know what? That's what bad men do. Bad men do bad things. But even in the midst of that, we can see how God ultimately is the one in control of all things. He orchestrates things to come to pass to accomplish His will. And He will use the sinful actions of sinful men to bring about His divine purpose. And we can't always comprehend it. We can't always wrap our minds around it. But even in the midst of chaos, or seemingly chaos, God is in control. And I just love that story. There's a lot more details, obviously, than what I gave you here tonight. You can go read about Squanto yourself. But there's a lot of bad information about this, too. Anyway, the Roman Catholics try to claim Squanto became a Catholic. I mean, these were Puritans. No, he didn't. Okay? He was discipled by Reformed Christians. And that's what he believed, and that's what he committed his life to doing, and those are the people he committed his life to serving with. And so, it's a good story. It's a happy story, especially in today's age where people would have you believe that Thanksgiving is an evil holiday because of their woke ideas and false beliefs about things. But it's actually a story of God's divine providence and people sharing and glorifying God through His provision. All right? Any questions? Oh, gosh, you would ask me that. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Wow, how far Massachusetts has traveled since then. And all the others over there beside them. Huh? Yeah. All right. All right. Any more questions? All right then. All right. Well, then we'll begin our prayer meeting. So if you need a prayer list,